Little BB King on this Friday morning. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion. An absolute delight to have you with us, and we thank you so much for being a part of the program. We have quite the show for you, and we'll get right to it. And all you have to do is remember that you can be a part of the program by writing to us at panel@wamc.org. Panel@wamc.org. Let us introduce the group today, and we have quite the group. We'll get started. Diplomat in residence at Bard College, former Ambassador Fred Hof. Good morning, Fred. How are you?
Joe, I'm fine. Great to be here.
Wonderful to have you on the program. We welcome Senior Fellow and Visiting Professor at Bennington College, founder of Beyond Plastics, former EPA Regional Administrator Judith Enck. Good morning, Judith. How are you?
I'm good. When I'm not paying attention to the news, I'm very good.
Well, guess what we'll be doing for the next 2 hours?
Oh, is that what the show is about?
We're giving Judith a panic attack over the next 2 hours.
Yeah, that's right.
Judith, you may have missed that the Yankees won last night. This too is news.
That's
yeah,
true.
not an issue for me. Thank you.
Well, thank you for, even with that, playing along. I appreciate it. And Siena College professor of economics, Aaron Pacitti, is with us. Good morning, Aaron. How are you?
Good. I'm thrilled to be here and nervous about the next 2 weeks.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about the next 2 weeks. That's where we'll start this morning. We welcome, we welcome your letters, panel@wamc.org, panel@wamc.org, and we'll be glad to go through your letters here in just a little bit. So the story on the front page of the New York Times is, what would happen if the U.S. defaulted on its debt? We had a story earlier this week on the program that we talked about, that one from the Washington Post, which was the doomsday scenarios. This is less of that, although, ... The U.S. debt limit has been reached, and the Treasury Department is finding ways to save cash after it runs out of maneuvers. What once seemed unfathomable could become reality. The United States defaults. What happens next? The far-reaching effects are hard to fully predict, from shockwaves in financial markets to bankruptcies, recession, and potentially irreversible damage to the nation's long-held role at the center of the global economy. The probability of a default remains low, at least based on opposing lawmakers' assurances that a deal will be done to raise or suspend the debt limit, and the long odds implied by trading in certain financial markets. But as the day approaches when the United States of America begins to run out of cash to pay its bills, which could be as soon as the 1st of June, investors, we'll get to the investigators later, investors, executives, and economists around the world are gaming out what might happen immediately before, during, and after, hatching contingency plans and puzzling over largely untested rules and procedures. So, Aaron, let us begin with you, and nervous about the next 2 weeks. And I guess it would be irresponsible for all parties to involve. I think it's easy for us in the media and even those in and around the Beltway to be somewhat jaded and say, we'll get to it eventually. Like there's going to be an agreement. Everybody will figure it out. Now, there's not a doomsday scenario. But you have to plan for a doomsday scenario, right?
And first of all, this shows how far we have fallen politically as a country. I mean, the fact that we're even talking about the wealthiest country in the history of world civilization considering default is a pretty ominous sign about what the future has in store. So before I talk about the scenarios, I think it's important to really get a handle on what the debt ceiling is, because if you understand what it is, it appears remarkably convoluted and antiquated. So in 1917...
So let's start there.
It's tough to take off the professor hat sometimes. In 1917, during World War I, the U.S. instituted a debt ceiling under the Second Liberty Bond Act. And What that did was allow the Treasury to issue bonds and increase the national debt without specific congressional approval. Prior to that, what happened was that anytime the U.S. government wanted to issue Treasury bills or government debt, they needed to file a borrowing request with Congress, and then that needed to be approved. So it was kind of a, piecemeal approach. And then during World War I, that got expanded to say the Treasury can do this without, continued congressional involvement, just provided they stay under a congressionally determined debt ceiling. So it's been with us for over 100 years. So the U.S. and Denmark are the only countries with a debt ceiling. The rest of the advanced world, none of those countries have a debt ceiling. And Denmark, unsurprisingly, just raises it without incident. But in the U.S., it's unique because when it comes to federal spending and government borrowing money, the way the government borrows money is by issuing bonds. And first, what happens is that Congress approves a budget for the year. And you would think that would be the end of the story, that Congress issues a budget and they just follow that budget and spend what they've promised to spend. But the debt ceiling imposes a second layer on that, and that is then Congress needs to vote to have the Treasury Department borrow money to fund the spending that Congress approved in the past. So it's convoluted, it's unnecessary, and now it has become dangerous, and it has become, borderline catastrophic. We've had 4, debt ceiling crises prior, 1995, 2011, 2013, and 2021. So Republicans, and it's only Republicans, Democrats have raised it, just as a matter of course. Republicans are now using this as part of their playbook, that if we don't like the spending initiatives that a Democratic president has gotten, instead of, figuring out a legislative way to deal with those, now they just are engaging in extortion. We don't like parts of the Inflation Reduction Act, so therefore we're going to threaten to not raise the U.S. debt ceiling and hold the world economy hostage until we get our demands met. So that's the backdrop of how this happens. And, obviously neither party wants a global economic collapse, and we're a week and a half away from it. So if Biden and, McCarthy do not reach an agreement, what that means is that the U.S. will default on payments, meaning the U.S. government has promised to make payments to Social Security recipients, insurance payments for Medicare and Medicaid, veterans benefits, financial aid to states for things like law enforcement and the court system, Department of Defense, and so on. And most importantly, all of those are important, particularly to Social Security recipients, people who rely on Medicare, veterans. But the thing that has the potential to trigger broad-scale global financial collapse is defaulting on interest payments to bondholders. Bondholders, the people who lend the U.S. government money, that's individuals like Fred, Joe, and I who might buy government bonds and have them in our retirement portfolio, large corporations like J.P. Morgan, foreign governments like the Chinese and Saudi Arabian governments, all buy U.S. government bonds for one reason, and they are considered a risk-free investment, that you can buy a U.S. government bond and get a relatively low rate of return on that, but the guarantee that you will be paid back with interest is as close to 100% as you could possibly have. So because of that, U.S. government bonds are accepted in almost every financial transaction that takes place on a global scale. When firms want to borrow money, the bank looks at their asset portfolio, and what banks look for is a steady and stable asset portfolio. So these businesses that are looking to borrow money frequently hold a fair amount of U.S. government bonds. So if you've got an asset portfolio big enough and the bank deems it, relatively risk-free, then those loans can be initiated. So what happens if the U.S. government stops making those payments to bondholders is those U.S. government bonds are no longer considered a valid form of collateral. So businesses can't borrow money. Investors demand a higher interest rate to lend the government money. Banks can no longer access traditional credit sources and therefore can't make loans to small businesses, individuals looking to buy a house or a car, all the way up to, big firms like J.P. Morgan. And the net effect of this, trying to, get out of the stop looking at the trees and start looking at the forest, is that if the U.S. government were to fault, we would have a credit crisis of unimaginable proportions where lending would just seize up, borrowing costs would go up. And people say, well, the world can get along, without access to loans. And that's just patently not true. The reason why businesses rely on access to credit is that, think of a firm like Boeing. They sell these multi-million-dollar airplanes. Well, if Southwest is buying one of those airplanes, they're not writing Boeing a check for, $10 or $100 million for a plane. They pay that off piecemeal over 10 years. So Boeing knows that they're going to have revenue coming in, but Boeing needs to make payroll every week. They need to pay rent every week. They need to pay their utilities. So to make up that difference, a lot of corporations rely on borrowing to meet short-term funding needs. So with a credit crisis, not only comes a decreased amount of lending and higher interest rates, but if businesses can't access credit, what you're going to see is a rise in layoffs, a decrease in investment spending, and that precipitates a massive rise in unemployment and recession. When Social Security recipients and, veterans and Medicare and Medicaid recipients realize that, we're not going to be able to access our monthly check, or we're not going to be able to go to the hospital, that's going to create uncertainty. It has the possibility to sharply increase personal and corporate bankruptcies. It decreases consumption. It makes it impossible for consumers to get loans to buy houses or cars. The stock market's going to crash, leading to an just devastating pension funds and retirement accounts. So the worst case scenario is financial Armageddon, that the U.S. defaults, that we can't make promised payments, and all of a sudden the faith and confidence and credibility foreign governments and the public had in the U.S. government disappear.
Well, other than that, Mrs. Lincoln, how was the play? No, this is the finest summation of the crisis I've heard. I noticed a piece in the Washington Post today where one of the analysts tried to schedule what actually kicks in and when if we default. And I notice right up front, military retirement, Social Security, Medicare. Yeah. I mean, speaking personally, that makes me 0 for 3. Yeah. Right at the beginning. But aside from that, Aaron referred to the global ramifications. This is a big subject at the G7 meetings. The reputation and reliability of the United States, and I see China as potentially a very, very big winner in this. Yes, the Chinese hold a lot of bonds. Yes, they wouldn't be paid interest for a period of time. But the reputational damage to the United States would be enormously in China's favor, and I wonder if Speaker McCarthy takes this into consideration. I know Xi Jinping, the president of China, as the head of the Communist Party, he's by definition an atheist, but I would not be surprised if he were to break out the rosary and pray that the United States defaults. This would be.
I think you can add Putin to that list too.
And you could, yeah. But the Chinese eventually would like to see their own currency either compete with or eventually replace the American dollar as the convertible currency in the world. And I think I think the Chinese are hoping and praying that we do our worst with this.
Let's see, Judith, we have about 2 minutes, and you can start, and we can come back, or I can hold, and we can you can begin on the other side of the break.
Well, I don't have much to add to Erin's brilliant analysis and Fred's insight. I think this all goes back to January of this year when Kevin McCarthy had to struggle to be elected Speaker. Remember, it took 15 votes, and I think a lot of the people he got votes from in the last round have made the debt ceiling a central part of their desire to be disruptors in Congress. So this is a really serious situation. I also think that if we go over the cliff and then even a small amount of what Erin described happens, I think they're all going to rush back to Washington to fix this. So the question in my mind is what happens, Erin, if we go over the cliff and then, 5 or 6 days later we course correct.
So that's a good cliffhanger for the next segment.
Yeah, that's a great cliffhanger. Thank you for setting that up, Judith. Brilliantly done.
My pleasure.
Now that we don't have TV writers, we now rely on you to make up these things and the denouement. So we will take a break. When we come back, we will we'll try to solve that little mystery and many others, because there are so many mysteries in our lives that we need to attack and figure out. We have Judith Enck, Fred Hof, and Erin Pacitti on our program this morning. We welcome your letters, panel at wamc.org. We will be right back. If we were a commercial station, we would try to take at least 3 more breaks before we gave the answer to the question that we set up before. But we're not that kind of broadcaster, so we'll go right to the chase, cut to the chase, and help us with set it up as to the question we left with.
So that was, what's going to happen and where do we go from here, kind of in the broadest terms. So first of all, financial market. So if you look at financial market indicators, they're betting on an agreement being reached. That, the financial industry and the business industry has enormous leverage in Washington, and they might be able to twist arms a lot harder than President Biden can. But you have a situation where there's already strains in lending markets because of the the regional banking crisis that happened in March. That's pushing up interest rates. That's lowering people's confidence, both in terms of lending and borrowing. And so even if we agree to, so even if there's a temporary default where we don't reach an agreement, that creates damage and is going to start rippling through the markets. The bottom line is that anytime you have economic uncertainty, and in this case it's over the debt ceiling, lenders get, cold feet. Borrowers don't want to take on massive amounts of debt during times of uncertainty. So lending rates go down, interest rates go up. So the best case scenario is, a clean increase in the debt ceiling with no strings attached. That's not going to happen at this point. The worst case scenario is a global depression that starts almost immediately. And then you have all of these intermediate cases, and I think those are the more likely options of, maybe the House decides to raise the debt ceiling for 6 months. But if that happens, we're going to be having the same conversation in, December. So all that does is kick the can down the road without any actual resolution. So this is ultimately, I think it's important to frame this. This is not a debate about government spending. The government can spend as much money as it wants, right? There's no constraints on federal spending aside from, the debt ceiling. The only risks of excessive government spending are higher inflation and higher interest rates. And those are legitimate risks that kind of, rein in the amount of federal spending. But as a whole, governments can spend as much as they want. So this isn't an issue so much about government spending as it is about who benefits from government spending. So this is really class warfare masquerading as, politicians taking a stand against, government overreach and fiscal irresponsibility. So what's on the table now, and where negotiations seem to have kind of settled, at least over the past week, is that, McCarthy has advocated for increased work requirements for people receiving income assistance programs, and Biden has indicated that he is open to that. So first of all, many social insurance programs have work requirements as part of that. I mean, President Clinton passed the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families Act with work requirements. So what McCarthy and his crew are advocating is to raise the age from 49 to 45 so that people who are in that age bracket actually have to work to receive the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, formerly known as food stamps, Medicaid, and then what we consider to be welfare payments, which is technically temporary assistance to needy families. So if you increase work requirements for those programs, it's estimated that will save about $120 billion over the next decade. Well, federal spending over the next decade is I'm trying to do the math in my head, about $50 trillion. So 120 billion out of 50 trillion is 0.000000001% of all federal spending. It's not going to have any major impact on the size of the debt or the deficit. It's imposing punitive measures on poor people. That's what those implications are. And, for people who are receiving social insurance, usually they face some difficult life and economic conditions. So raising work requirements assumes that there's jobs available for, disabled people who are 50 where they can just go out and find jobs. It's about 40% of the population who lives in poverty, and those who are the primary recipients of federal spending and social insurance programs work full time. So we're not talking about what Matt Gaetz has called couch potatoes or what President Reagan called welfare queens. We're talking about people who are primarily working minimum wage jobs on a full-time basis who need government support to help them bridge the gap. So this is a war on the poor. Plain and simple. This is not an issue about, inflation or interest rates or the appropriate reach of government. And, as Fred pointed out, and I'm going to kind of tee him up for this one, here is, the world superpower, the largest economy in the history of world civilization, quibbling about spending and whether or not poor people should be entitled to a modicum of income support programs. We're quibbling about this while Putin is just, continuing to march into Ukraine, and there appears to be no signs of letting up. China is building up its capacities, presumably for an invasion of Taiwan and perhaps other areas. And those two world leaders probably could not have hoped for a better outcome for their own intentions. So, that's kind of, the state of things. And, Biden's at the G7 summit and, where the U.S. used to be the leader. Now, all of a sudden, the remaining 6 countries are sitting there questioning what the hell is happening over there.
Yeah, these battles over the debt limit are never very edifying struggles. But now the timing just strikes me as particularly bad. I mean, there's a very, very real question out there that I'm sure is being asked very politely, very diplomatically at the G7. But the question is, are American domestic politics such that the United States really cannot sustain its leadership in the world? And this is a question, I suppose, that's semi-independent of whether Donald Trump will be taking the inaugural oath on January 20th, 2025. If we're going to have these battles periodically about the validity of the federal debt, this is going to have an enormously bad impact on our reputation globally. I mean, more than 50% of the world's foreign currency reserves are held in U.S. dollars. in the form of treasury bonds.
Precisely because they're considered safe. They know it's a valuable asset that's not going to depreciate in value.
One economist described it as the golden goose internationally, and that there would be people who would, consider killing the golden goose on the grounds that perhaps it's laying too many eggs. It's purely nonsense.
Judith?
Well, I think a lot of this is driven by some Republican members of Congress who are just determined to divide the country. I mean, it is nonsensical. When you look at the work requirements that Aaron just talked about, most people that are collecting food stamps, now known as SNAP, are working. If you look at married couples, 84% have at least one person working, and 49% have two people working. And the problem is the low wages. And so this fiction that people are getting nutritional support because they're not working, it's just not true. And in fact, sometimes when you apply for a low-wage job, large corporations give you a food stamp application as part of the hiring process. So this is just a terrible attempt to divide the nation, to do economic damage, and this is the price Kevin McCarthy paid to be elected Speaker. My prediction is they're going to go over the cliff. People are going to start seeing what this means in their personal lives. There will be no change.org petitions. People will organically start calling their members of Congress. They will course correct within a week, and then some pretty significant economic damage will have been done. I don't think even the Marjorie Taylor Greenes of the world and the Matt Gaetzes of the world will sustain thousands of people calling their offices and telling them that they're suffering because of their position. And I also think a lot of this is politics, trying to embarrass Biden overseas. During that infamous CNN town hall meeting, did Trump say that he was okay with government default? Can someone correct me, please?
Yes. No, he said that.
Yeah, he said it might not be a big deal.
And they asked why, and he said, well, because I'm not president.
I'm not president.
Yeah. So there's that.
Yeah, that's a big that, isn't it? Well, let's take a break. When we come back, we'll go into your letters, and we will tie up some loose ends on this topic and move on to others as well. Panel at WAMC.org. Panel at WAMC.org. We will be right back. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion. Judith Enck, Fred Hof, and Aaron Pacitti with us this morning. We are talking about the debt ceiling and the negotiations that are ongoing and the scenarios that could unfold over the next few weeks. Aaron?
So what's remarkable in its absence in all of this debate, if Republicans are so concerned about the size of the federal debt, it's remarkable that you only hear them talk about reductions in government spending and not increasing taxes. You don't hear them talking about, more stronger IRS enforcement, particularly of high-income tax evaders. So I think that shows you the hypocrisy, and that's why I consider this a form of class warfare, is that they're not concerned about the size of the deficit. They're concerned about who's benefiting from government policy. So, it would be very easy to reduce the size of the deficit and the debt by instituting a millionaires and billionaires tax that 99% of the population would never pay. That would be a great way to reduce the debt and take care of, an issue Republicans claim is, existential to the, health of the United States economy. So there's that issue. And the second thing that's worth pointing out is there's obviously a political element that's evolving here, and that is, Biden should never have started negotiations with hostage takers, because what we have now is a pretty weak proposal about, work requirements for people who receive social safety net programs. You're going to have Republicans, the harder line Republicans, who are going to say, nope, not voting for a debt ceiling increase, even if we get work requirements, because this is not a meaningful reduction in government spending. And then on the same policy, you have Democrats like John Fetterman who's saying, I'm not going to vote for this policy that's guaranteed to send more people into poverty and reduce the safety net that's holding a lot of Americans out of extreme poverty. So now Biden, because he started these negotiations, now has a political crisis brewing coming from both sides. Sympathetic Democrats who are saying, we can't do this, this is cruel, and Republicans saying, well, we're not going to vote for it because it's not big enough. So, how this resolves itself is really anybody's guess.
Yeah, and in that connection, in the past, when this has come to the brink, there have been sufficient numbers of adults in the U.S. Congress to come up with compromise consensus proposals that actually proved quite useful. Mm-hmm. Now, I don't know what I don't know. There may be talks going on. There may still be a sufficient number of people who are serious about public policy in the U.S. Congress on both sides of the aisle, but I'm not. It's not obvious that the Congress itself is taking the initiative on this.
This is a different Congress and a different House than we had in 2011 and 2013.
Yeah, for sure.
Those were Tea Party Republicans who at least had concrete policy demands.
Yeah.
Now you have the crazies, for lack of a better term, who are just off the rails and are just going to, it's a party of grievance. It's a party of trying to, owning the libs and embarrass Biden. And that's their ultimate goal. So I don't think you can appease those individuals.
Yeah, you would hope there would be a sufficient number of air-breathing people on that side of the aisle. I mean, we've got two people in the Hudson Valley, Republicans, Representatives Molinaro and Lawler, who by all appearances seem to be quite serious about government and governing. So it's possible.
Are you skeptical, Judith?
I think it's quite possible that the 15 or so bomb throwers can be offset by a similar number of people who would not go that far.
Judith?
Didn't the two of them just, they vote with the majority? Wasn't there just a vote 2 weeks ago on the debt ceiling, and they voted the wrong way? There was something that 2 weeks ago that was really outrageous.
They voted for McCarthy's proposal. I think they had the sense that this was basically a free vote. If there is a discharge petition that comes forward on the House floor, they'll have another chance to represent their constituents.
Yeah, but when it mattered, they didn't. And so, this kind of, it reminds me of when we all thought Ivanka Trump and Kushner were going to be a moderating force on Trump, and that, of course, never happened. And I think waiting for Lala and Mark Molinaro to break away from the pack, they had their chance 2 weeks ago.
I'm not predicting really that it's going to happen, but I can, if I were to try to put myself in the position of either of these two representatives, I'd see there's a really, really, really tough choice.
But didn't they just, not to be argumentative, but didn't they just make the choice on the last vote when they voted with the majority? That was their moment to signal that they're going to be more of the sane middle.
I think they did not. They didn't consider that vote to be the final decision over whether or not the United States defaults. Whether they're correct or incorrect about that, I don't know. but I think that was their calculation.
You're very generous.
And if you can't be argumentative on a talk show, where can you?
Yes.
I mean, this is the forum, Judith. We have letters. We'll get to as many as we can before the top of the hour, and we have quite a few. So let's get to them. Can you please pass on information about exactly where to find the statistics regarding Medicaid and SNAP? I'd like to be able to show the numbers to my family members who believe that too many people are gaming the system. They probably won't believe them anyway because it will come from a government website. But at least I can try.
Yeah. So the trustees of the Social Security Administration and Medicare have fairly easy to understand executive summaries of their annual report, and that kind of lays out the high level analysis of how much is being spent, what the long term budgetary implications of that are. So those are two good places to start. The Congressional Budget Office also releases its 10-year forecasts. Those can be a little technical, but are also good places to start. And yeah, they come from government websites and people who are disposed to just, be, anti-rational or anti-intellectual. You're just going to not believe those on its face. But, those are the reliable statistics that, as Fred pointed out, the adults pay attention to.
And SNAP is administered by those crazy people at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. So
Right,
it's
right.
USDA.gov, and you can get all of the SNAP and food stamp statistics, those wild ones at USDA.
Pete checks in and says, I think it behooves us to take a look at the totally cynical GOP modus operandi. First, create difficulties and hardship for those least able to defend themselves. Second, blame it on the Democratic leadership. Third, pretend they alone can fix it. Fourth, get themselves elected and reward the wealthy and well-connected. Then they get themselves voted out, and then you repeat.
Yeah, no, that's fair. The irony here is that
Cynical and fair.
it's primarily the population of red states who receive the majority of social insurance programs. So Republicans who are voting against this are voting against the interests of the low-income individuals who support them in their own districts. And I think the letter writer's right. You do that and say, oh, sorry, that was Biden's fault. And then it just, if you can take a step back and take your political viewpoints out of it, it is a absolutely beautiful strategy to maintain their grip on power.
Elizabeth would like help on this. Why would Social Security recipients be affected by the default when it's supposed to have its own fund, separate from other parts of the government?
It does. Social Security is a separate entity, but when the federal budget is calculated, it calculates all of the outlays the federal government's going to make, including those to Social Security recipients.
Don writes, the last time around on the debt ceiling, the Republicans pulled back as it was clear that they were losing the PR battle. What happened? Yeah, I don't know.
Good question.
Yeah, I
It's
saw the writing on the wall, I assume.
Kevin McCarthy and the deal he had to make to become Speaker. I mean, this is Marjorie Taylor Greene's Republican Party. She is in a leadership position in the U.S. House of Representatives. Does anyone think she's going to act responsibly here? No. And so this is what's happened. We
I don't know if you were waiting for us to agree with you, but we agree with you anyway.
I think the other thing that's happened, and I think somebody made the point on the roundtable yesterday, is that the Republicans have been doing pretty well in the messaging battle over this.
Absolutely.
And that may make a big difference in how all this turns out.
Okay. We have this letter that says, for the first time in weeks, the panel is actually speaking the truth about the debt ceiling. This is an excellent debt ceiling discussion. The battle is between the oligarchs and the rest of us. And the most disappointing thing to me is that the Democrats refuse to say out loud the points brought up by the panel. Then Lynn says, Dear panel, thanks for a very complete and illuminating discussion of the debt situation. Then Brian, You all are just pathetic.
I know. It, in other aspects of my life, perhaps.
I assume that had to do with the content of the program. I don't know. Then Mark said...
That was just generic? That was the whole letter?
Yeah, that was it. You're just pathetic.
Guilty.
Yeah. I mean, my self-esteem is shaky at best on most days, so
Yes. Guilty is charged.
Right, I'll cop to pathetic on most hours. Mark says, I find it extremely disturbing that the programs being targeted are the ones that will help Americans. Most of them would decrease the debt long-term. Improved medical care will cut long-term costs. We average 50% more per capita spending on health than the second highest country, Germany. Cutting infrastructure that will employ millions is a mistake. Ridiculous tax cuts hurt. Both parties are responsible for the debt, yet the party currently in charge is targeting primarily Democrat spending while ignoring their role in the debt.
Yeah. One thing to keep in mind is that when the government runs a deficit, that is a surplus for the private sector. So the bigger the government deficit, the more money the government owes people like us, private citizens.
More letters, more topics, more excitement, more fun, more news. Next on the Roundtable. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our panel discussion this morning featuring Judith Enck, Frederic Hof, and Aaron Pacitti. And we welcome you, panel at WAMC.org. We would love to hear from you this morning. And boy, we're really hearing from you on the issue of the debt ceiling. So I have a lot of letters. I will get to as many as I can before we have to move on to other subjects. We go to this one. I'm going to rip through these, but please jump in if you would like to address anything. Anthony says, I think Judith makes an interesting point. I was listening to Morning Edition today, and I can't say I just thought of this notion, but it finally took a solid form in my head. Marjorie Taylor Greene is not the sole cause of all of the United States woes right now, but she is the face of it. And I know what scapegoating is and how bad it is, but I'm all for scapegoating in this case. Let's put it all on her. Then we go to Alice. Why are we not out in the streets calling for the salary of Congress to be contingent on a functioning government? Then Lynn. Thanks very much for a complete and illuminating discussion of the debt situation. I do have a question. Can Kevin McCarthy just change his behavior and compromise if he wanted to? I.e., what would happen? Could the crazies legally vote him out?
Yeah, that was one of the concessions he made to be voted Speaker of the House, if I recall correctly.
Yeah, he conceded that that they could raise the issue of whether the Speaker should be dislodged, challenged by a vote, even repeated votes.
Single vote too, if I remember correctly.
Yeah. Andre says, simple question here. During the last lame duck session, when Democrats held all reins of power, why didn't they deal with this? They are supposed to be grown-ups, right?
Yeah,
well, they did. they during the Trump administration, they extended the debt ceiling 3 times, right?
But I think the letter writer is talking about the more recent lame duck session when Democrats had the majority in the House and then the slim majority in the Senate.
Yeah, good point.
That's a good question because, first of all, Joe Manchin would have been yet again an obstacle, but Joe Manchin is probably an easier person to negotiate with than the Freedom Caucus. So, yeah, Biden was definitely behind the curve on this. That would have been the opportunity to say, boy, we can see what's coming. Let's try to take care of it now. Even if it means some difficulties with members of our own party, that was certainly preferable to what's happening now.
I think, says Doreen, Fred Hof is giving former Dutchess County executive and now Representative Marcus Molinaro too much credit. Molinaro called for Santos to resign, but then voted to refer to Ethics Committee instead of voting for the Democrats' expulsion bill, typical Molinaro. Then we go to Jerry. Food stamps are really corporate subsidies. The Walton family make hundreds of millions every day and have workers on food stamps. Republicans subscribe to a neo-slavery mentality, expecting people to toil for a non-living wage. It's called systemic exploitation. If you cannot pay a living wage, you should not be in business. Then we go to Alan. Judith says the crazy caucus want to divide the country, but I believe they have drank their own Kool-Aid and think they speak for the majority of the country, not the gerrymandered disaster that elected them. Lillian says, I believe all money given to the poor goes back into the system, i.e. rent, food, medical. I don't think the poor are hoarding money, so in essence, the wealthier are benefiting from helping the poor. This letter on the debt ceiling from Don. The last time around on the debt ceiling, the Republicans pulled back as it was clear that they were losing the PR battle. I think I already asked that question. I apologize. John says holding the world's economy hostage in order to get their way is basically threatening other countries. Could other countries declare Republicans global terrorists? Probably not.
I think not. No.
Yes. All right. We go to this letter. Two more in this pile. We have many, many more letters, but these are two more that I can get to. Bob says, why can't Biden call the Republicans' bluff and preemptively stop making certain payments to save money for bondholders? Let's say he says that he's going to lay off all civilian air traffic controllers as of May 30th. In betting the Republicans would cave in a New York second, albeit screaming all the way.
Well, the Treasury Department did begin taking extraordinary measures earlier this spring to reallocate federal spending to prioritize, interest payments to bondholders. So part of that has been enacted. The size of the amount that the federal government owes bondholders probably couldn't be taken care of with selective layoffs.
Andrew writes to us and says, I work in a recession-proof career, so I really don't care about this debt ceiling. As a matter of fact, as a millennial who can't afford to buy a home due to interest rate hikes, I'm actually hoping for a full-on recession. What are more benefits for people like me whose employment won't be impacted? My pay won't be impacted. As a matter of fact, I'm due for 3 pretty good pay raises, regardless of how the economy plays out this year. Will I finally be able to afford a house? Could I replace my nearly 20-year-old car finally? Could I actually go on a vacation? That from Andrew.
But who would want to go on vacation with this guy?
Really?
Yeah.
I mean, how cynical and negative can you be?
There is.
Well, let's just say it's not the most public-spirited statement we've heard read on this show.
But to play the devil's advocate, I think it raises an important point about some people will be affected more than others if an agreement isn't reached. But if an agreement is not reached, what was his name, Andrew?
Yeah.
Fasten your seatbelt, buddy. You're going to, believe me, a recession-proof job is not necessarily depression-proof.
All right. Well, that was a good way to end that segment. So let's go to what else is making news this morning, and we go to this story, which is that heat will likely soar to record levels in the next 5 years. This is from the World Meteorological Organization forecast. And what it says, this was released, I believe, officially yesterday. The global temperatures are likely to soar to record highs over the next 5 years, driven by human-caused warming and a climate pattern known as El Nino, forecasters at the World Meteorological Organization reported. The record for Earth's hottest year was set in 2016. There is a 98% chance that at least one of the next 5 years will exceed that, the forecaster said. While the average from 2023 to 2027 will almost certainly be the warmest for a 5-year period ever recorded. this will have far-reaching repercussions for health, food security, water management, and the environment, according to the Secretary General of the organization. We need to be prepared. All right, Judith, here's the hard question. How do we prepare?
Well, Andrew would just stay in his air-conditioned apartment, not going on vacation. I have to let that go, right?
Still going to pick on Andrew. Okay, go ahead.
I know. I'm so annoyed by that letter. Nothing personal, Andrew.
Oh, no, it doesn't sound it at all.
Don't you love it when people just lodge at the worst insult possible, and then they add either nothing personal or with all due respect.
Yeah.
Whenever
Yes,
anyone
exactly.
starts with all due respect, I'm like, oh no, this is not going to be good.
What an
All right.
idiot. I mean it in the good way. Go ahead.
So yeah, this is part of a pattern. I don't doubt these forecasts. The past 8 years are the hottest on record, 2016 being the hottest year on record ever. So people will die from heat stroke. We're going to see more asthma, more wildfires. Farmers are really going to suffer, so the price of food will go up when crops are either lost or less yield. We will see more tick-borne disease because of the heat. And I guess the only good thing is Jeff Goodall will sell more books. He
Right.
is so ahead of the curve. Our friend, New York Times bestselling author, friend of WAMC, Jeff Goodall, has a new book out called The Heat Will Kill You First. And it's really worth looking at. These are very serious long-term trend problems here that will increase fatalities around the world. And I was only, I was very unkind to Andrew. Forgive me. But a lot of people think, oh, we'll just sit in our air-conditioned house more. You have a friend in Florida. They just spend the whole summer months in air conditioning, increasing demand on the electricity grid. But it's not just about our own little cocoons. We see what happens when hurricanes get more intense. We see what happens with wildfires. I remember wildfires being in isolated forests. They're now, in the West at least, hitting the suburbs. And there are also concerns that we're going to see Western-style wildfires in the Northeast. So this is incredibly serious. Every state legislator, every member of Congress should be paying attention to this. There are things we can do. At the federal level, establishing the infrastructure bill, the IRA, was really important. It's record investments in energy efficiency and renewables and electric vehicles. But then months later, President Biden approved the drilling project in Alaska called Willow and other drilling projects for fossil fuels on public lands, even though President Biden said in his campaign that he would not support new fossil fuel drilling on public lands. And so, the thing that keeps me up at night is our current political system is not equipped to handle the reality of climate change. So, the IRA, really good, one step forward. Drilling on public lands, really bad, 2 steps back. This is not going to solve the climate crisis. So there's a lot that we can do as individuals. I think the leadership is coming from state governments, not the federal government, unfortunately. When big states act, they can do something. And while the whole world is focused on the June 1st deadline on the default, I'm really focused on June 8th, which is when the New York State Legislature will adjourn. They've got bills before them. There's one called the New York Heat Now bill that would remove ratepayer subsidies for new gas lines. provide more funding for energy savings and electrification and rebates for low-income New Yorkers who cannot afford things like heat pumps. So, that is unresolved. Is our state Senate and Assembly going to adopt this? I'm doing a ton of work on a packaging reduction bill. The Deborah Glick and Senator Harcum, Assemblywoman Glick and Senator Harcum, have the New York Packaging Reduction and Recycling Act. That has a lot to do with climate change because producing plastics relies on chemicals and fossil fuels. What's going on with that bill? The chemical companies are lobbying to weaken the bill by allowing this Orwellian term, so-called chemical recycling, which is heating plastic and turning it into a little bit of fossil fuel or, on the rare occasion, new plastic, the last thing we need. That's not as obvious to some people as a climate change issue, but if New York were to reduce single-use plastic packaging by 50%, as this bill requires, that will reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So the other problem with climate change is not just the inability of our current democracy to make systemic changes, but also the fact that the solutions are so plentiful. It's literally thousands of things that can be done. It's not just one thing. And and I've got to quote Bill McKibben, who years ago said, winning slowly is losing. And we are really running out of time here. The earth will survive, but people will really suffer. And the forecast for this summer, and we've seen it around the world, record heat in India. Greenhouse gas emissions doesn't always only cause increased heat, but also more violent weather. A number of people were reported killed in Italy yesterday due to just gargantuan amounts of rain. So we see this in front of us. And the problem is the fossil fuel lobby and the chemical lobby and the death grip that they have in Congress and in state legislatures. We know what to do, but can lawmakers step back from their campaign contributors and actually drive down greenhouse gas emissions? That is the only move right now. And the longer we wait, the more severe the greenhouse gas cuts are going to have to be. And then it's a much steeper mountain to climb the more we wait, and we're wasting valuable time.
Let me take cynicism for 500, Mayim, and that is, why are we it seems like every couple of weeks we have another report like this that comes out and from another organization that scares the zippers off of you. So what exactly do and I guess you could ask the same question when we're talking about the gun issue in this country. Mm-hmm. What does it take to make a movement for people to take this seriously? God knows we certainly have been warned enough.
Right. Yeah, it's pretty disheartening. Scientists have been ringing the bell on the climate crisis for decades. I think the only action here is political action, and I don't mean in a partisan way, but we've got to get elected officials, everyone from local government on up, to take the climate crisis seriously. When Ray Graff did the news, I listened closely when he announced that.
Don't we all?
I don't always, but when he mentions Ulster County Executive Jen Metzger, my ears perk up, because when you hear her name, it's always something really smart that she is announcing. She announced apparently yesterday a new comprehensive commitment to housing in Ulster County, and that the new housing would include renewable energy resources. everyone should just do what Jen Metzger is doing in Ulster County at the local level. And then we need governors to step up and not be, in the pocket of fossil fuel companies. It's political science more than atmospheric science, and the solutions are there. This is not like a really difficult scientific equation that we can't figure out. We've got to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and that is going to take some political leadership, because the plastics industry, the fossil fuel industry, the chemical industry is well represented in Albany, in Boston, in Hartford, in Washington, and they are there to preserve the status quo, and the status quo is killing us.
Aaron.
Yeah, so Judith did an excellent job highlighting the environmental concerns around this, but there's also the economic issues that are going to flow from this. When you have more severe heat, you're going to have more frequent droughts. That's going to lead to crop failures. And not just in the U.S., this is worldwide. So that's going to raise food prices. That's going to lead to higher inflation. That's going to lead to layoffs. That's going to create global instability, particularly in lesser developed countries where people are really living at the margins. You're going to have hurricanes and more extreme weather that's going to cause extensive damage to coastal cities and require a lot of rebuilding. So what you're hearing is that, all of this is going to require more concerted government action just to deal with the economic fallout, let alone the devastation on the environment. So you're going to have, government assistance to farmers to deal with, failed crop harvests. You're going to need government assistance to, coastal areas that are hit hard by hurricanes. And all of this, when you kind of take a step back and look at this as a whole, is we've clearly entered into a world that's just full of constant crises, whether it's the debt ceiling, whether it's, in record heat. And historically, when you have a world that's plagued by constant crisis, people feel uncertain, they feel vulnerable, they feel marginalized, they feel desperate. And the natural instinct to that is to vote for more authoritarian candidates. So when you look at the economic and the political implications, just temporarily ignoring the environmental ones, this is leading to a very, very dark future.
On that note, we will pause. We will take a break, and when we come back, we will finish up our section together on the Roundtable Panel. We welcome your letters, panel@wamc.org, panel@wamc.org. Judith Enck, Fred Hof, and Aaron Pacitti all with us this morning. We welcome your input, panel@wamc.org. We will be right back. Good morning. Welcome back to the Roundtable and to our last call for letters this morning and our final segment with our terrific panel. Judith Enck, Fred Hof, and Aaron Pacitti making up the group, and we welcome you, panel@wamc.org. Fred, is there anything you wanted to add about the issue?
Yeah, I just wanted to say, I'm far from an expert on this, but I found this report by the World Meteorological Organization to be truly alarming. I'm just wondering. I know that people in our government, people involved in national security, foreign relations, are actively looking for ways at present to reduce tensions, de-escalate tensions with China. An initiative that seems to be welcome in China as well. And I wonder if somehow the U.S. and China can put together some kind of joint initiative aimed at addressing the problems raised in this report. If they can, I would expect that John Kerry, Special Envoy for Climate Matters, will be running up his airline miles.
Let's go to a couple of letters that we have on this subject, and then we'll move on to our final topic for this morning. Linda says, I hear so many young people concerned about global warming, and sometimes I hear that it's my generation's fault. I'm 67. I've been marching for solar energy and environmental and political concerns for so many years. When are the young people going to march? When are they going to raise their voices and demand results from Washington on guns, on the environment, on global warming? How can we motivate them?
Well, many are taking action. I had the pleasure a few days ago of meeting with the Tennessee legislator, Justin Pearson. He and another Tennessee legislator, remember, were expelled from the state legislature because they were protesting gun violence after the awful killing of elementary school students in Memphis. And then a week later, both Justins were reinstated. And before Justin Pearson was a high-profile Tennessee state legislator, he was a climate justice activist. And what he said to a small group of us that had the privilege of meeting with him this week was, he's 28 years old, and he gets frustrated when people say, "Oh, your generation is going to solve the problem. Good luck with that." And he spoke about the need for a intergenerational and multiracial coalition to work on climate change issues, and he's right. We all have to tackle this, and groups like the Sunrise Movement are working with young people, and Bill McKibben's group, Third Act, is working with older people. I personally don't think we necessarily need age distinctions. We need everyone in the boat. But young people are taking action. They don't have the political influence that the fossil fuel and plastics and chemical companies do.
I met with Justin Pearson on Wednesday as well. And
good.
And we did an interview that aired yesterday, which you can find online at wamc.org. But how inspiring is he?
Yeah.
I mean, I said at one point, I said, I'm a middle-aged white guy, and that assumes that I'm going to live to be 110. But how do we get more young people like you to go out and to fight for these causes? And he said exactly what you just mentioned, that importance of having a broad coalition of people.
I have been flying high since Tuesday, meeting him. And
I agree.
I'm so glad he's interviewed on WAMC. I will go in and listen to that. But he has accomplished so much at the age of 28, and Greta Thunberg from Sweden, and the students involved in the Sunrise Movement. They're doing it. They're just not being listened to. And my big worry is that they may not turn out in the next election because they are disappointed by the record of the Biden administration. And when I talked to students, I said, I agree. I wish he was not supporting more fossil fuel drilling, but what do you think life is going to be with a second Trump term? Get over it. Let's go. We got to deal with what we got.
A couple more letters, and then we'll go on to the final topic. Marty says, one thing about your remembrance about forest fires no longer remaining in the forest, but are now in the suburbs. Gee whiz, the suburbs have expanded into the forest fire regions. The big problem that really needs to be addressed in the U.S. is development. It needs to be stopped. Man continues to build, occupy, and then move on, leaving vast decay and concrete wastelands. We need to reverse that course, go back and repair the damage already done. We'll be living in a vast parking lot. Barry says the starting point to solving the climate crisis and many others is to remove private and corporate money from elections. That would make big pharma, big oil, big whatever impotent, and politicians would no longer be owned. But we're not smart enough to do that.
I personally think that's exactly right. The Citizens United decision is basically the Dred Scott decision of our era.
All right, final what do we got? About 7 minutes here. So, final. and I want to see what we want to talk about. Well, panel, would you like to talk about... well, let's talk about Dianne Feinstein. I thought this is an interesting story. Senator Feinstein's health complications from shingles, more severe than disclosed, is the headline in the Washington Post. The senator, who's 89, returned to Washington last week after having suffered more severe health complications from her shingles diagnosis than were previously disclosed. The shingles triggered encephalitis, which is inflammation of the brain, as well as Ramsay-Hunt syndrome, which causes facial paralysis, according to Feinstein spokesman Adam Russell, who added that the senator has since recovered from the encephalitis complication. The additional health issues stemming from the case of shingles that hospitalized the six-term senator in February were first reported by the New York Times. Feinstein returned to the Senate last week after facing pressure to resign from a few members of Congress and California progressive groups who complained her months-long absence was showing judicial confirmation and imperiling the Democratic agenda. Feinstein returned in a wheelchair and was greeted outside the Capitol by Senate Majority Leader Chuck Schumer, who later said that he planned to move forward on many more judges with her vote in the coming weeks. Although her return has resolved Democrats' math problem on close votes, her condition has raised concerns that she might not be up for the demands of the job. The path-breaking senator has withstood multiple rounds of calls for her resignation, even before her most recent illness, as unflattering anecdotes emerged about her memory lapses and her perceived cognitive decline, as well as her visible reliance on aides in public-facing aspects of the job. This week, that picture worsened as she faced questions from reporters from her wheelchair, as she appeared to be struggling with her vision and her memory.
Yeah, I think it's a very sad case with many political implications. Dianne Feinstein has been an absolute giant of the U.S. Senate during most of her six-term tenure. She obviously has terrible medical problems. The one thing that she's fully capable of doing, apparently, is declining invitations to resign. She wants no part of that. It's politically complicated by the fact that the California governor, Gavin Newsom, has pledged to appoint a black woman to the Senate if Senator Feinstein resigns. There are 3 announced candidates. So Senator Feinstein has already announced that she will not stand for re-election in 2024. There are 3 candidates, all members of Congress, one of whom is a black woman, Barbara Lee.
Yes.
The other 2 representatives, Adam Schiff and Katie Porter, obviously would not like to see a situation where their third rival becomes Senator Lee and therefore has the advantages that would normally accrue to an incumbent. So there is some objective political interest, at least on the part of 2 candidates, I would think, in seeing Senator Feinstein hold on just as long as she can. But it's I think it's becoming apparent that it's very, very, very difficult for her to execute her duties as a United States Senator.
And Nancy Pelosi is a big Adam Schiff supporter, and Pelosi is very close with Feinstein, and so there's some speculation that might be influencing her decision. But, as Fred said, she's had an incredible career. She's 89 years old. Showing up for votes is one important part of a U.S. Senator's job, but they have to do much, much more than that. Fighting for their constituents, introducing bills, putting coalitions together to pass the bills. Is there any question that, she's lived an amazing life, she's struggling right now, she's got to resign? I'm just baffled why this is even a debate. And gosh, she's worked hard.
Yeah.
Go out and in a positive note. I just am so concerned that this is dragging on for so long with enormous implications, not just for judges, but many federal agencies still need undersecretaries and assistant administrators approved. Joe Manchin is blocking all of the EPA appointments until Biden withdraws one of the Clean Air Act regulations. So we've got that nightmare. But this is not Dianne Feinstein's finest moment, and her